Hello and welcome to this short presentation looking at how Britain changed between 1715 and 1900. We're going to be looking at two images of Britain and looking at 7 areas of change, one at a time, and just comparing them to get an understanding of how Britain changed. So we're going to start with transport, and we just focus in on the first picture. In 1750 we can see that transport was largely by foot. If you were lucky enough to have a horse, you might be riding a horse, but most people would walk to where they needed to get to on rough, unfinished roads. If we fast forward to 1900, we have the use of electric trams. The big improvement by the time we get to 1900 is the invention of this thing, which is the train and the railway. So in 1750 it would have taken someone to travel from Liverpool to London 3 to 4 days, doing it by foot or by horse. However, by 1900, due to railways spreading across Britain, that journey time could be cut to around about 4 hours. The next change I'd like to focus on is the changes in power. So again, if we start in 1750 and see the types of power that would have been using, would have been wind power, water power, and horsepower. All of them fairly clean and sustainable. However, none of them were going to be able to produce things at a great pace or in great numbers. And that's the big change that happens by the time we get to the 1900s, is those 3 types of power have been replaced by steam power, mainly from the coal that we can see being quarried here in large quantities, which is then led on to electricity and also the use of gas as a power source as well. So the power has changed a great deal in the 150 years that we're looking at. Next on our list comes employment. So again we start with 1750. We see here the main employer within any area of Britain in 1750 would have been agriculture, would have been farmland, and we can see people here working in the fields. By the time we get to 1900, yet another change. We see, because of the power we looked at a second ago, the use of factories to produce things in large numbers, which we'll come back to later on in the presentation. So we have factory after factory after factory being built where people would now be employed. Getting back to our list, so we've done the top 3, we come now to housing, how that changed between 1750 and 1900. So we look here, simple cottages, single story, thatched roofs, not particularly warm in the winter, probably very, very warm in the summer, not particularly comfortable for people to be living in. There would have been some larger houses, but these would have been kept for the rich, the landowners, the people who had the money, and they were few and far between. Most people would have lived in the villages that we see in this picture, but there were some towns starting to crop up, but very, very few. There was only in 1750 one town with a population at over 100,000. So most people would have lived in rural areas. Fast forward for the 1900s, we see, because of factories attracting people to areas, lots and lots of houses being built close together. These are back-to-back houses which brought their own problems, which we might look at in the lesson. But these are the types of houses people would have been living in. 2 stories, possibly quite cramped, not particularly nice to live in, but made of brick, rid of the thatched roofs, a little bit more developed. Come now to population change, and the best way to look at this is from afar. We can look at the 2 pictures here side by side, and it's fairly clear to see that in this scene we have more people living by the time we get to the 1900s. So just some figures for you. England's population in 1750 was only 4 million people. By the time we get to 1900 it had gone to 30 million people. For the population of Britain, we had 9 million people living in 1750. By the time we get to 1900s, we get 40 million people. And just some statistics around people living in towns and out of towns, as I mentioned earlier. In 1750, less than 2 out of 10 people would be living in towns and cities. By the time we get to the 1900s, we have 8 out of 10 people living in towns and cities. So we see a massive population change, not just increase in numbers, but also where people are now living. Which brings us to the last two changes, which are changes that happen, but also reasons why ultimately these changes happened in 150 years. We'll start with agriculture. We focus again on our farm. We see these people here working in the fields by hand, using their hands to cut down the crops and using horses to drag their wagons. It would have been a very slow process, would have been very difficult. If we zoom out, we see what's known as an open field system, where there's no walls, no hedges, no fences. People farm their land. It's a very open system. Fast forward to the 1900s, we see just about here, we can see some steam rising. It's the invention of steam power, use of steam tractors. No longer manual labour, it's becoming much more mechanised. The big change in farming, though, was not particularly exciting, but very, very important. The building of fences, hedges and walls to enclose land, which meant that you didn't just grow crops anymore, you can now keep animals, which would also mean that you had to employ fewer people, because once you can enclose a field and enclose the animals, they pretty much stay where they need to be, so you need fewer people to look after them. Which brings us on to industry. So as agriculture changed, fewer people finding employment in agriculture, something else needed to come in and take the place, and that was industry. The industries in the 1750s would have been very small scale, so we've got a forge here, very, very small scale, 1 or 2 customers a day. The type of industry there was known as the cottage industry. We can see this man here looking after his sheep. He would look after his sheep, and then when they needed their wool cutting, he would take their wool off. And then that wool would be taken to a cottage, where it would be spun and maybe woven, and eventually then that would be taken off to market in the town. Very slow process, not masses of wool and cloth being produced, but all of it happening within cottages, usually with the family helping out. Again, we fast forward to the 1900s, we see the same picture that we saw earlier with all of these factories, mass production, hundreds of people working within these factories on shifts, so that it was a 24-hour process to produce anything that could be produced. Mainly textiles would be produced in large quantities to then be shipped around the world and sold in markets for huge profits. So we come back to our list here. We've covered those 7 main areas. We've looked at how those changes have happened, and as we go into the lesson, we'll be looking at why they changed and also the impact of those changes as well.